Section 39 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. Freedom in Everyday Life. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 23 through 33. The Corinthian church, which consisted mainly of Greeks, with a few Romans and a few Jews, had the Greek characteristic of a love for argument and theory and endless discussion. They had caught up a phrase which Paul himself had used, "All things are lawful for me," and quoted it, apart from the qualifying and limiting context in support of arguments which Paul could not accept. Chapter 6, verse 12 and chapter 10, verse 23. Paul had been speaking in favor of Christian freedom. That which is not in itself wrong is lawful. So far, that is quite true, but it needs much qualification in practical life. An action may be quite lawful, but very inadvisable. A person who is trying to break himself of the smoking habit would not be wise to travel in a smoking carriage. A reformed drunkard, anxious to do right, but still weak, should not pass through the street where his old cronies are wont to assemble. As a general rule, unless an action tends in itself to cause positive good, one may well think twice about doing it. But further, in all one's life and actions, it is right to think about the effect that may be produced on one's neighbors and associates, and not simply to consider whether it is lawful or expedient or convenient for oneself. The Christian congregation is a band of brethren, and the interests of the whole brotherhood should be considered in all that one does. A life which is led on the principle of doing all that is lawful for oneself is a purely selfish life, and is therefore not a Christian life. This general rule Paul now applies to a question which was much discussed in the early church, and which presented itself in practice constantly to every Christian. Society was at that time organized on a pagan basis. The forms and ceremonies of ordinary courtesy in private society and in political and commercial life were pagan in character. Public meetings were opened with pagan ceremonial. Ought a Christian, therefore, to refrain from using his rights and performing his duties as a citizen? The giving thanks to God before and after meat took a pagan form as an invocation of the gods. Was a Christian to absent himself from every social meeting in a pagan house and confine himself absolutely to the society of Christians? To do so would cut him off from many opportunities of benefiting his fellow citizens and of spreading the knowledge of the truth, and would amount almost to a boycott of all non-Christians by the Christians. How far was it justifiable or right to accept the established forms of social intercourse and to ignore the pagan character in many of those forms? This was always a difficult question, and it was answered in varying fashion by different persons and in different circles. Some were far more strict in this matter than others. The question answered itself in later times, when Christians became the majority and the forms of social courtesy took a Christian character. But in the first century it was a burning question. It presented itself in a very acute form in regard to the eating of meats that had been offered to idols. much of the flesh sold in the butchers' shops was cut from victims that had been offered in sacrifice. Many of the dinner parties given in society followed after a religious ceremony, such as a marriage or the coming of age of a son, and the flesh set on the table was that of the animals which had been offered in sacrifice to the gods. When a Christian bought meat in a shop, was he to ask whether it was sacrificial? Paul answers unhesitatingly, no. The earth is the Lord's, and everything that is in the earth has been made by him, and all that he made is good. The ox is good in itself. The idol to which it has been offered is a thing of naught. The flesh of the animal remains the same, whether offered or not offered. The idol has no effect upon it. Again, if a Christian was invited to a dinner party by a pagan friend in his own house and accepted the invitation, was he to ask, as each dish was set on the table, whether it had been offered in sacrifice? Here, again, Paul unhesitatingly answers, no. Eat whatsoever is set before you, asking no rude question. Courtesy requires this, and Christian principle does not forbid it. Social intercourse would be impossible, and all the amenities and grace of life would be destroyed if such questions were obtruded on the company in which one had taken one's place. It is open to anyone to refrain from going into the society of those who differ in religious opinions. But if ye are disposed to go into their society, then the customs of polished courtesy should be observed. One exception, however, is made by the apostle. If someone should challenge you and pointedly declare that the meat set before you has been offered to an idol, then you should not eat of it. You should refrain, not for your sake and because of your conscience, but for his sake. He is probably a person of delicate and over-scrupulous conscience, and he may have doubts as to whether it is right to eat such food, and yet, seeing you eat, he may, through shamefacedness, be induced to do what he believes to be wrong and eat like you. Thus your freedom may be a snare to your brother. This is a principle of conduct to which one must always have regard in one's daily life. One must think not merely of one's own feelings and judgment about right and wrong, but also about the effect which one's actions may have upon fellow Christians. There are actions from which one should refrain, even though one sees nothing wrong in them, simply because they may give offense or cause danger and error to one's brethren in the congregation. A Christian must always sympathize with and be mindful of his brother Christians and act for their sake as well as for his own. Yet while one sympathizes with the weaker and more delicate conscience of others, and refrains from hurting or misleading them, one must preserve one's own freedom and strength of mind. One should in those cases refrain consciously for the sake of others, and not lose one's own boldness and freedom. We should not suffer their conscience to be the judge of our liberty. In such matters, the robust conscience is the healthy one. The delicate conscience, which is always on its guard and is constantly in terror of doing anything wrong, is weak. But one must have regard to one's weaker brother and not allow one's own freedom to do him harm, though one feels that the true Christian is strong, bold, and decided, not weak, apprehensive of evil, and timorous. Above all, one should refuse to allow the weak to condemn the strong. If I partake with thankfulness of such meat, then I should not be condemned or evil spoken of regarding the food for which I thanked God. It may happen that we hear some weaker Christians tell with horror and condemnation that such another dined with a pagan and ate meat of an animal that had been slain in sacrifice to Jupiter or some other idol. In such a case, we should not keep silence and allow him to be condemned. We should defend him and take his part. The main rule of conduct for Christians should always be, even in such small matters as eating or drinking, to consider whether the act will conduce to the glory of God and the enlargement of His kingdom. In His kingdom there are both Jews who are over-scrupulous about small rules of life and Greeks who are freer in mind. Let us refrain from offending either Jews by needlessly outraging their scruples, or Greeks by trying to impose on them the narrower rules of Jewish scrupulousness. After writing this paragraph, Paul seems to have felt that something was needed to complete it. We are conscious, as we read it, that in pleading for liberty he has expressed himself in terms which are a little hard in tone. There is an element which must be added to modify and to perfect this 10th chapter, and through consciousness of this, Paul adds in chapter 13 the wonderful exposition of the power of Christian love and the urgent importance of bringing love to bear on all matters of life and conduct, which forms the subject of section 35 and of section 39.
Section 40 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. Section 40. Self-Denial, the Proof of Love. Romans 14:10-21. The early Christians, small groups scattered over the ancient cities in the midst of a numerous pagan society, had to decide what their conduct should be in many delicate matters of social conduct and etiquette. Political meetings for voting, or for judicial or other purposes, always began with some pagan religious ceremony. Was the Christian citizen to abandon his right of voting, to give up all share in political life, and to absent himself from all public meetings, or should he attend them and take a part, though only a silent part, in a pagan ceremony? All magistrates of each city had to take an official position in the many religious rites which were performed to ensure for the state or the city the favor of the gods. Were Christians to refrain from the career of public service, or could they take official part in those rites? In private life, similar difficulties faced them. If they went to a social gathering or a dinner party, there were pagan sacred rites to sanctify the assembly. The saying of grace before eating and after took the form of a rite in honor of a false god. Yet the acknowledgment of the divine kindness and grace, which was made by pagans at every meal, was in itself a right thing, which every Christian must approve and regard as springing from a true instinct, though misdirected. If one bought a piece of meat in a butcher shop, it was usually, as has been mentioned in section 39, the flesh of a victim that had been offered in sacrifice at some pagan temple. Thus, the life of a tiny group of Christians in a pagan city was compassed about with a cloud of difficulties. If a member of the little congregation was to make it his first object to avoid all participation in idolatry and all contact with anything that had idolatrous associations, his daily life would be spent and wasted in investigating a multitude of details, since he was at every step brought into some kind of relation with something idolatrous, and he would have no time or energy left for the greater things of life. He could only with difficulty get out of the presence of an idol, for idols were everywhere in the streets and in the houses, painted on the walls, or cut in stone or wood, or molded of clay or metal. Would it be wise, or even permissible and justifiable, to inquire scrupulously into the history of every article sold in an ordinary shop, lest it might have come in contact with an idol? That would practically mean that the Christian must needs go out of the world, as Paul remarks in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9. For there was no room left for them in their native cities. Ought the Christians to cut themselves off wholly from social intercourse with their pagan neighbors? If they did so, they would lose many opportunities of coming into relations with them and influencing them. If the Christian were to criticize and blame every idolatrous action of his pagan neighbors which came before his eyes, he would make life unendurable for himself and for his neighbors. The fact remained inevitable that the Christian in a pagan city must shut his eyes to, and tacitly acquiesce in, much that was idolatrous, and much that he disapproved and hated. The difficult question was to determine when he ought to cease to acquiesce and begin to show open disapproval. The question was answered differently by different persons. Some engaged in the public service, as officials or magistrates or soldiers, and allowed the inevitable pagan rites to be performed in their presence. Some avoided public service as far as possible, showing themselves far more scrupulous and tender of conscience, and these were blamed by their pagan neighbors as unpatriotic, morose, and idle, because they left the duties of public life to others who were more willing to work for the public good. Innumerable such questions faced every Christian daily. He must answer them in his life, and the answers given were necessarily various. From this variety of conduct sprang another difficulty. Those who were scrupulous were apt to condemn those who allowed themselves greater latitude, while the free-minded were apt to condemn as weak-minded those who showed themselves more scrupulous. It was an almost greater difficulty that some people who felt it wrong to act with bold freedom in their intercourse with society and political life were yet so much coerced by fear of contempt or ridicule from their strong-minded brethren that they used a freedom which they felt to be wrong, and thus endangered their character and conscience. Paul has now to lay down general principles of conduct, which may guide his congregations in these minor points of life, and his first rule is that Christians shall be slow to judge one another. Neither should the scrupulous man condemn his brother for being too free, nor the bolder man condemn his brother for being weak and over-scrupulous. We must all be judged by God. We are all God's servants. We have therefore no right to occupy God's place as judge of his servants. One judgment alone we must rigorously pass upon ourselves, that we do nothing which may hinder the moral development of any of our fellow Christians. It must, of course, be remembered that Paul is not here speaking about the great questions of moral right and wrong. There are cases where a brother falls into real wrongdoing and crime, and then it becomes our duty to condemn and even in extreme cases to hold aloof from the evildoer. Paul is here concerned with matters about which opinion may reasonably and justly differ. The right line of conduct will be determined by love. You may feel that a meat is not made unclean because the animal was sacrificed to a pagan god, but do not wound a brother's feelings while you display your freedom of mind by eating it. Christ died to save him. Will you not deny yourself in this small matter to help him? Will you put a strain on his conscience and perhaps lead him into doing what he thinks wrong? Any matter of food and drink belongs in itself to mere human life, and is not a part of the kingdom of God. Such matters are temporary, evanescent, and unreal. We should live in and for the kingdom of God, i.e., for what is eternal, enduring, and true. And to that category belong righteousness, peace, and joy in the Spirit, not meats and drink. These greater things we shall attain by seeking always to do what will tend to produce peace among our brethren, and to build them up in goodness of character. In itself, wine, like meat, is not evil, but it is evil in its effect on the character and life of society. Do not, for the sake of a mere drink, overthrow the work of God, for that is what you do if you help by your example to spread the habit of intoxication. You will show the true spirit of love in your action. You will foster throughout the whole sphere of society in which you are placed the mighty realities of goodness, concord, and joy in the Holy Spirit, if you sacrifice even your free-mindedness in order to avoid wounding the feelings or endangering the moral improvement of your neighbors and brothers. Hold your own beliefs as far as you can justify them to God, but let your beliefs be between God and yourself. In your action and life, think of your neighbor and show your love for him. It is not your beliefs, but your conduct and your love and your self-sacrifice that make your life. These are the things that stand the test and last through time into the eternal kingdom of God. Thus, those difficult questions of conduct which the early Christians had to answer in their life, and many delicate questions which we in the modern world must answer one way or another in our action, are best solved not by abstract discussions as to what is right or wrong, justifiable or unjustifiable, but by applying the practical test. Which course of action helps our brother, tends to improve society, and to establish righteousness and peace and joy in the world? In this treatment of the question addressed to the Romans, one feels the influence of that wonderful chapter about love, 1 Corinthians 13. The tone in which the question is treated seems gentler here than in 1 Corinthians 10, see previous section, and yet the answer is not essentially different. Only the tone is changed. To the Romans, Paul insists less on freedom and more on love. Freedom is a noble thing, but love for one's brother is nobler. The apostle's view is practically the same in both passages, but in the first he lays more stress on the Christian right to be free. In the second he speaks far more of the Christian duty to act with love and sympathy. In this life of ours, it is usually far more needful to strengthen our love for our neighbor than our desire for freedom to do as we think right. We are all very keenly alive to our rights, but we are not always so vividly conscious of our duties. End of section 40. Read by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA. February 2nd, 2023.
Section 41 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. The Beginning of the Crisis, Acts 21:17 through 22:29. After the informal welcome on the day of their arrival, the delegates were formally received on the following day by James and all the elders of the Jerusalem congregation. Luke was present. He does not intimate that he was present at any of the subsequent proceedings in Jerusalem or Caesarea, but when the voyage to Rome was beginning, he resumes the use of the first-person plural. During the intervening period, he must have been near Paul, but he was not actually taking part in any of the incidents that occurred, and hence he could not with propriety employ the first person. This is evident to anyone who reads the intervening chapters and contrasts them with the paragraphs where the narrative is expressed in the first person plural. Paul conveyed the salutations of the Gentile churches and narrated the story of their growth and all that they had done. The elders made suitable acknowledgment, and then turned to the topic which was weighing on all minds, viz., Paul's danger. To guard against this was a prime necessity. The elders pointed out that there was great misapprehension even among the Jewish Christians as to what Paul had done and taught among the Gentiles. He had changed the front of the Christian church. He had made it look towards the Gentile world, and he was himself looking towards Rome and Spain for its future growth rather than towards Palestine. Even the Christian Jews were suspicious of the change, and there were many thousands of them. Chapters 4:4, 6:1, 8:1, 9:32, etc. Their suspicions were fed by false reports spread in Jerusalem by the Jews from Asia and the other provinces when they came up to the great feasts in Jerusalem. These declared that Paul was teaching the Jews to abandon all the customs of their forefathers and the law of Moses, and such reiterated reports, the Greek verb in 21:21 is far stronger than the English informed, had produced a strong prejudice against Paul among even Christian Jews, while the non-Christian Jews were enraged in the highest degree. When great numbers of Jews, Christian and non-Christian, were collected in Jerusalem for Pentecost, the situation was very grave. James and the elders in this passage of the Acts are the same persons who are called in the Epistle to the Hebrews, 13:24, them that have the rule over you. It is clear that in the epistle, the persons addressed are the mass of the Palestinian Christians who were not in perfect agreement with their rulers regarding Paul's teaching and conduct, and who looked on the apostle of the Gentiles with suspicion and even dislike. Luke here implies exactly that situation. James and the elders, who were the rulers, are evidently anxious that Paul should now disabuse the minds of the Jewish Christians of their misapprehension and suspicion regarding his action and his principles. Luke does not inform us why the elders had apparently made no attempt to explain Paul's real attitude to the mass of the Christian Jews. Certainly they speak here as if the prejudice had spread uncontradicted, and it looks as if Luke were thus indicating that the elders had not been sufficiently careful of Paul's interests. He does not blame them, but he refrains from praising them. Now, however, they showed themselves anxious to avert the danger. Probably the coming of the delegates and the full statement of the actual facts had dissipated some prejudice from their minds. Paul's intention in this embassy from the new churches to the old seemed to be in process of fulfillment. The suggestion was made that Paul should display to the multitude his personal observance of the law. There were 4 men known to the elders as having taken a vow. These had to pay their vow by sacrificing and by shaving the beard and dedicating the hair that had grown during the month preceding. The expenses of the ceremony were considerable, and rich Jews often showed charity by paying the charges incurred by poor men in this way. It was proposed that Paul should pay the charges for these 4 men and should perform the ceremonies along with them in the temple, and he immediately proceeded to act upon the suggestion. The ceremonial lasted in regular course through 7 days. About the 5th or 6th day, the storm burst. Some Asian Jews saw Paul in the holy part of the temple, where no Gentile might intrude on pain of death. These Jews knew that he had been accompanied by 2 Asian Gentiles, and immediately, without any investigation, they inferred, or pretended to believe, that he had brought his traveling companions with him into the temple. They seized Paul and shouted for help, explaining loudly their charge against him. All the Jews rushed on Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and the officials closed the doors, which ordinarily should have stood open, against the hated and impious criminal. When Paul was about to be murdered by his assailants, the tribune who commanded the Roman garrison in the Tower of Antonia, which dominated the temple and with it the city, hearing of the riot, ran hastily down the stairs that led from the tower to the temple with a troop of soldiers and their officers, and saved Paul from the hands of the Jews, but bound him with 2 chains. The officer then tried to learn what was the cause of the riot, but the confusion was too great, so he ordered Paul to be brought up into the castle. Such was the crowd and its violence that Paul had to be carried by the soldiers up the stairs, but when he was at the entrance to the castle, he seized an opportunity of explaining to the tribune that he was not a rebel, but a Jew and a citizen of that important city, Tarsus. The fact that at this moment, when he was bruised and doubtless bleeding from the violence and blows of the Jews, and excited with the struggle and the rescue from imminent death, he should have spoken of Tarsus with such pride, shows that the memory of his own city, the home of his childhood, lay always close to his heart. Further, Paul's every word and act at this moment of supreme danger evince remarkable courage, coolness, and self-possession. His one thought now was to seize the occasion of speaking to the people, when he had a great crowd before him with their attention fixed on him. This might be an opportunity of bringing home the truth to them, and, with the tribune's permission, standing on the stairs, he beckoned to the people and addressed them in the national tongue, Aramaic. The use of the Semitic speech instead of Greek, which probably the whole audience understood, and the foreign Jews generally knew better than the Jewish vernacular, marked in itself his claim to be a true Hebrew. Paul was a good linguist. He could evidently speak with equal ease and power in Greek and Aramaic. He knew the ancient Hebrew of the Bible, and when he planned to visit Spain, he must have been confident that he could address the audiences of the cities there in Latin. The speech which he made on the castle stairs was a defense against the charges which, as he knew, were being privately made against him, of having forsaken his nation and abjured the Mosaic law and profaned the temple. His plan was to bring home to the people the real facts by a sketch of his life, showing how bigoted a Hebrew he had been from childhood, how true he had been to the Jewish tradition and custom, how bitterly he had persecuted the Christians, how finally he had been convinced of his error only by the direct intervention and orders of God himself. His account of his persecuting unto the death does not imply that he had intentionally been instrumental in putting to death other Christians than Stephen alone. The words do not necessarily indicate more than the death of one Christian, and the Jews had not the authority to execute. Only some isolated, sudden outbreak of fanaticism and murder under great provocation might be, and usually was, allowed by the Roman government to pass unpunished, but such conduct could not be permitted to be carried on systematically. For example, in the present case, if the tribune had been too late in intervening, and if he had found Paul already dead or at the point of death, probably no notice would have been taken of the crime, because the explanation would have been accepted that Paul was detected in the act of bringing foreigners into the forbidden place, and that the passion of the mob was roused to frenzy. But the tribune succeeded by his quickness in preventing the crime, and so it might have been in the case of Stephen, if there had been a sufficiently active and watchful Roman officer at hand, eager to stop riots at the beginning. It is to be observed how much stress Paul lays on the superhuman element in his conversion. In this supreme moment, barely rescued from death, he spoke from the depths of his heart the truth as he knew it. He was profoundly convinced that God had repeatedly revealed his will directly to his servant. It was, however, vain to hope that the passionate excitement of the mob could be calmed by an appeal to facts. And the moment that he named the Gentiles, the word recalled the crime of which his assailants believed him to be guilty, and their frenzy broke out anew. Paul was then taken into the castle, and the tribune proposed to examine him by torture as a barbarian and a criminal who would speak the truth only under the lash. But Paul appealed to his rights as a Roman, and proceedings were instantly stopped and changed. End of section 41. Read by John R. Moore, Albertville, Alabama, December 2022. Section 42 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. The Real Issue Between Paul and the Jews. Acts 22:30 through 23:35. Although Paul was now safe for the moment, his position was still a dangerous one. The first duty of every Roman governor was to maintain peace. If he failed to do that, he was responsible. Now Paul was a source of disorder. He stood alone against a nation, but the nation would be pacified if the one man were slain. And in such a situation, few Roman officers would hesitate to take the easy way of securing quiet without investigating too carefully the rights of the case. The tribune had been on the point of torturing Paul to extort a confession, after which the prisoner would have been executed and peace restored. Paul was saved by the influence and privilege which belonged to him as a Roman. Yet even against a Roman, the charge of having, however unintentionally, caused a riot was grave, and for the governor of such a troublesome populace as the Jews, there was always a strong temptation to propitiate them by sacrificing the hated individual. One man would die, and the nation would be saved. The analogy of Paul's case to the seizure and execution of the Savior must have been present to Luke's mind in this part of his narrative. A preliminary investigation was held on the following day by the tribune in order to determine the real facts, which as yet he had been unable to discover, and he called the Supreme National Council to help him in the investigation. The meeting thus convoked by a Roman military officer was not a formal assembly presided over by the high priest in his official dress. It was an informal meeting of the counselors aiding the tribune to determine the facts. Neither the council nor the tribune had the right to condemn a Roman, but if there seemed to be a case against him, a proper report of the facts must be made to the governor of the province, who was styled procurator. At this meeting, Luke could hardly have been present, and his knowledge was probably derived from Paul himself. The account of the meeting is incomplete. It was doubtless opened by a statement from the tribune as to why he had called the assembly and what he had done. But Luke hurries on to the point where Paul was called to speak for himself. The prisoner began with the remarkable words, addressed not to the tribune, but to the counselors of his nation, "Brethren, I have acted as a citizen in all good conscience before God unto this day." The sequel shows that these words were in some way peculiarly offensive to the Jews, and as we do not know what had been said previously, we can only guess what was the cause. There is no reason to think that the Jews would be offended because they considered that the prisoner was speaking in a self-righteous tone, for the words are only a protest in Jewish style that he was innocent and faithful to the religion of the nation. But the single word, "acted as a citizen," seemed to the Jews of Palestine to amount almost to an unconscious confession of guilt. The accusation against Paul was that he sacrificed Jewish customs to Greek, and here he used a word which was characteristically Greek, and which assimilated the Jewish life under divine rule to the godless, free, self-governing life of Greek citizens. The thought and word constituted an insult to the Hebrew spirit, and the high priest Annise bade those who were beside Paul smite him on the mouth. Paul's indignation at such treatment flamed out in the disrespectful, passionate words of verse 3. He did not know that it was the high priest who had spoken, for he had been absent from Jerusalem, except perhaps in chapter 18, verse 22, since Ananias was appointed, and the latter was sitting as an ordinary member of the council with a Roman presiding. His hot retort roused a cry of horror. "Answerest thou the high priest so?" Paul, learning who had spoken, apologized instantly in words quoted from the Greek version of Exodus 28:28, differing slightly from the Hebrew version. There followed an incident which has caused much difficulty and great variety of opinion among modern readers. Paul perceived that there was a want of harmony in the council, some being Sadducees and some Pharisees. We have seen that the attitude of the two factions towards the Jewish Christians was very different, though they were united for a time by common hostility towards Stephen. Paul had always been a Pharisee from personal conviction and through heredity and early training, and he understood the Pharisaic point of view. The temporary union between the two Jewish parties could not obliterate their deep-seated disagreement. And Paul, who always claimed to be still a true Pharisee, a member of the patriot and popular party, opposed to the cold and aristocratic Sadducees, described the nature of the charge against him in a way which would attract to himself the sympathy of the Pharisees. Luke saw nothing wrong or unworthy in this, and he was best able to judge. Paul was winning over the Pharisees not merely to himself, but to the Christian cause. He was showing them the real issue that was involved, withdrawing their attention from the secondary issue of his own personal case, and concentrating it on the true nature of Jewish patriotism. He maintained that the true Jewish patriot and the true Pharisee should be a Christian, as he himself was a Pharisee while a Christian. Philippians 3:6. It was only misapprehension of the facts that united Pharisees with Sadducees against the faith which was bringing Judaism into its proper line of development. Yet Canon Farrar, in his Life of Paul, mourns with deep sorrow over Paul's words, "Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead am I called in question," on the ground that they are a clever trick of misrepresentation and special pleading, suitable for a smart lawyer, but unworthy of the great apostle. They do not misrepresent the case. They go below the surface and touch the real nature of the situation. The hope of a Messiah could be fulfilled only through the resurrection of the dead, and the resurrection of Jesus was the guarantee of the wider hope for all men. 1 Corinthians 15:14. Paul states the same view more fully in chapter 26, verses 6 through 8, where there is no question of a clever trick, for there were no Pharisees among his judges. So keen dissension now arose between the two factions in the council that Paul was like to be torn in pieces during their quarrel, and the tribune took him away to the castle for safety. In the night that followed, Paul was cheered by a vision of the Lord, who stood by him and told him that he must bear witness at Rome. The great plan should be fulfilled. The visit to Jerusalem, which Paul intended as a preliminary to his Roman work, as we have seen, was to be so, though the manner in which he should go to Rome was not that which he had had in mind. The divine will was working out Paul's intention after its own fashion, and his life in the following years was not arranged as he had intended when he spoke to the elders of Ephesus and told them that his work in that region was finished and that they should see his face no more. He went to Rome, but as a prisoner, and he came again to Ephesus and to Macedonia to revisit his churches and to complete his work. Luke is careful to show that at every critical point in his career, Paul was guided and informed by direct revelation of God. This is implicated in the structure of Acts, and you cannot get rid of the superhuman element without discarding the whole book. Next day came a sudden change of scene. Paul's family, which Luke has not previously mentioned, had not wholly deserted him when he became a Christian. His nephew came to reveal a plot against his life, and the tribune, recognizing from the nature of the conspiracy and the desperate character of the Jewish fanatics that Paul was not safe in Jerusalem, sent him under a strong guard to Caesarea, which was reached after a journey on horseback lasting through the night and the following day. The letter which the tribune wrote to the procurator misstates the circumstances, because the writer wishes to present his own conduct in the most favorable light, and pretends that his action from the beginning was intended to save a Roman citizen from molestation by Jews. A touch like this shows the truth of real life. The letter contradicts Luke's narrative, but the difference is due to the nature of the tribune, and proves the excellence of Luke's knowledge and the accuracy of his history. End of section 42, read by John R. Moore, Albertville, Alabama, December 2022. Section 43 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. Progress of Paul's Case in Palestine, Acts 24. The Jews, finding that the plot against Paul's life had been foiled by the tribune's sudden action in sending the prisoner to Caesarea, resolved to follow him thither and prosecute the case before the highest authority in the province. The tribune had shifted the responsibility from himself to the governor, claiming at the same time credit which he hardly deserved for zeal in saving a Roman from the Jewish mob. The officer had been on the whole kindly in his behavior to Paul after discovering that the latter was a Roman, but he exemplifies the common weakness and indecision of Roman administration in the provinces, the unwillingness of officials to bear responsibility, and their readiness to please the populace, even at the price of serious injustice to an unpopular individual. We see the same qualities in Felix's handling of the matter during the next 2 years, combined in his case with baser motives, and in Pilate's conduct at the trial of Jesus. On the 5th day, the Jews reached Caesarea, bringing with them a professional legal pleader named Tertullus to conduct the case. The hearing took place on the 12th day after Paul had reached Jerusalem. The ample space which the historian devotes to this brief period is unique in the Acts, and shows his sense of the critical importance of what was now occurring. There is nothing approaching to it in the whole book, except the proceedings regarding Cornelius and the account of Paul's voyage from Syria to Rome. To understand the character of Luke and his conception of a historian's task, the student must study with special care those 3 episodes in their relation to the plan of the work as a whole. The arrangement of the events during these 12 days is not unimportant, yet accurate apportionment is difficult owing to the fact that ancient writers and ancient society were not so careful as we in modern days are forced to be about matters of time, whether in regard to days or hours. Business habits, strict punctuality, and strict reckoning of time are modern and Western, not ancient and Oriental. The probable arrangement of the 12 days is as follows. We take it that Paul reached Jerusalem just after sunset, so that according to Jewish reckoning, this occurred in the same day as his visit to James on the following morning. 1. Reception by James and the elders. First day of purification. 2 through 4. Second, third, and fourth days of purification. 5. Fifth day of purification. Riot. Paul's speech on the castle stairs. 6. Meeting of the council. Paul's dream during the night following. 7. Plot to slay Paul is arranged. 8. He starts for Caesarea before midnight and reaches Antipatris before dawn. Annise learns of Paul's departure, first of the 5 days, chapter 24, verse 1. 9. Paul is handed over to the procurator Felix in Caesarea. Second day. 10 through 11. Paul in Caesarea, third and fourth days. 12. Fifth day. Arrival of Annise and Tertullus in Caesarea. Paul denounced and the investigation begun. In the investigation held on the 12th day by Felix, Tertullus stated the case for the prosecution. According to the rules prescribed in the ancient schools of oratory, he began his speech with an elaborate compliment to the governor, designed to conciliate his favor. And in complimenting him on the excellence of his administration, the orator went far beyond the limits of truth. Felix had in reality been an exceptionally bad governor, and 2 years later the Jews complained to Nero about his conduct, and he was recalled. Tertullus next stated the charges against Paul. They are 3. 1. Paul had been a cause of disorder and sedition among the Jews throughout the Roman world. This charge is a clever misrepresentation of the fact that serious differences of opinion among the Jews, sometimes ending in riot, had occurred in many of the cities which Paul had visited, but it hides the truth that the troubles had always been originated by Paul's opponents, and that his friends had been unresisting sufferers. Still, it was a dangerous charge, considering the character of most Roman officials, who were bent on keeping things quiet at almost any cost. 2. Paul was a leader of the Nazarene heresy. This was not a serious charge. The Romans had no desire to interfere between one Jewish sect and another. The accusation is made only to lead on to the next charge. 3. Paul had profaned the holy place. The Romans had legalized the Jewish ritual and recognized any outrage against his ordinances as a crime. The profanation of the holy place would be a serious outrage, but it would depend greatly on the character of the individual Roman governor what view he would take of the offense. In practice, the Romans generally would have winked at even the murder of such a criminal by an infuriated mob if he were caught in the act and punished at the moment. But later, when momentary passion had passed and the crime was tried in a court, few Romans would have treated it as very grave. The weak part of Tertullus's case was that he produced no evidence to support his charges. The accusers were there, but they had no witnesses. They merely asked Felix to question Paul and judge from the answers. Paul, in his reply, fastened on this weakness. Like Tertullus, he began with a compliment to the governor. But unlike Tertullus, he restricted himself to the truth. Felix had governed the Jews for many years, and the prisoner might fairly congratulate himself, as he did, on speaking before a judge who knew the law. He denied that he had ever carried on any discussion with anyone in the temple, much less provoked riot there or in any part of the city. And he challenged his accusers to produce any evidence of their first charge. To the second charge he pleaded guilty, but pointed out that to be a Christian implied full acceptance of the whole Jewish scriptures, both the law and the prophets, full confidence in the hope of the Messiah and of the resurrection, and perfect innocence and good conscience towards God and men. The third charge he denied absolutely. The answer was complete, and in the absence of witnesses to support the charges, conclusive. Luke mentions that Felix had a comparatively correct knowledge about Christianity, i.e., he knew in what relation it stood to the Roman law. This remarkable statement plainly shows that a Roman governor had already, when this first case came before him, a fairly exact notion what view Roman law took of the new faith. In other words, the precedent created by Gallio in Corinth expressed the official Roman opinion. Roman administration refused to regard the preaching of the new faith as a crime. Felix, however, would not take the responsibility of offending the Jews merely to do justice to a single person. He postponed the trial for further evidence, thus giving the Jews another chance, though at the same time he showed every indulgence to Paul consistent with safe custody. He even listened to Paul's preaching, and, vicious and corrupt as he was, trembled at the thought of the coming judgment, yet his terror did not prevent his hoping that Paul might offer a bribe to buy release and freedom. As Felix was a man of high position and wealth, brother of the richest man in Rome, and husband of a princess, he could not have thought of a paltry bribe. Paul's antecedents and position, of which a corrupt ruler certainly informed himself carefully, suggested the hope of a bribe such as Felix would care to accept. This is a proof beyond question that Paul was believed by the governor to have command of considerable wealth. Men like Felix do not mistake a pauper for a wealthy man. This state of easy custody lasted for 2 full years, until the beginning of summer A.D. 59. We cannot suppose that Paul spent the time in idleness, but no record is preserved, except that, on our view, the epistle to the Hebrews was written in 59 by Philip and the church in Caesarea under the direction of Paul, but in Philip's own words, except that Paul himself added the last few verses. End of section 43. Read by John R. Moore, Albertville, Alabama, December 2022. Section 44 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. Paul's Appeal to Caesar, Acts 25 and 26. When 2 full years had passed over Paul's head in light and privileged confinement, Felix was recalled to Rome on account of the complaints made by the Jews against his greed and injustice, and being desirous of propitiating his enemies by some concession, especially one which cost him nothing, he left Paul in prison. Festus, the new governor, arrived in Caesarea during the summer of A.D. 59. He at once made a brief visit to Jerusalem, where the Jews petitioned him to bring up Paul for trial, but he resolved first to investigate the case in Caesarea before granting their wish to have a trial in Jerusalem. Again, there was enacted a scene similar to the trial before Felix 2 years previously, the Jews accusing Paul and bringing many charges against him without any witnesses to prove their case. We observe here that the Jews stood on a far higher plane of morality than most Asiatic peoples. Embittered against Paul as they were, they made no attempt to bring forward invented evidence. In trials, there was some respect for truth. Even the false witnesses who gave evidence against Stephen and against Jesus did not invent words which had never been used by the accused. They testified to words which had been spoken, but which were misinterpreted and misunderstood by the witnesses and by all the Jews. The Hebrew people had many serious faults, but it is right to acknowledge that morally they had advanced far above their neighbors. The law of Moses had produced an effect on the race. They were self-righteous and hard, but they aimed at righteousness of a narrow yet real kind. The law had been to them a schoolmaster, as Paul calls it, and had placed them on a moral platform fitted to bear the superstructure of true Christianity, whereas the pagan converts had no such platform of moral custom and education to stand upon, and Paul had often occasion to be horrified at the hideous crimes into which they could fall when they stumbled. It was slow work to build up this needed foundation of morality in the pagan cities. At the new inquiry, Paul again denied the charges, and when Festus asked him if he were willing to go to Jerusalem and take trial there, he appealed to Caesar. In other words, he claimed to be tried before the supreme tribunal of the empire, over which the emperor, or more commonly a judge acting for the emperor, would preside. Festus, after conferring with his legal advisers, granted this appeal, and remitted the case to the highest court of the Roman state. Here again we have clear proof that Paul was considered by the Roman officials in Caesarea to be a person of standing, and therefore of some wealth. The Roman governor would not send up for trial before the imperial tribunal any and every person who chose to appeal. He had to judge first of all whether the case and the person was of sufficient importance to be sent on to Rome, for he had himself full authority to judge and to condemn or acquit in such cases as this. How did it come about that Paul, who in the cities of Asia and Europe had maintained himself by the labor of his hands, appeared now a Roman of rank, believed by Felix to be able to offer a bribe worthy of a rich man's acceptance, and regarded by Festus as one whose appeal to Caesar must be forthwith accepted? Surely we must understand that formerly he had voluntarily chosen to teach and exemplify the dignity of labor, that he had deliberately elected to be a missionary in the sense that Jesus had ordered, taking no purse with him as he traveled and preached, and rarely even accepting food unless it was earned by his own labor. Philippi, with its generous hospitality and its twice-repeated gifts of money when he was in Thessalonica, being the solitary exception which he allowed, and that only when he was constrained by pressing kindness. Now had come the time for a different policy. He had gone to Jerusalem, he had faced death there, and he had received the divine instruction that he must bear witness to the faith in Rome. Towards Rome his face was set. His trial must be decided there, and not in Jerusalem. He must appeal to Caesar, and in the metropolis of the world, before the supreme tribunal, he must plead the cause of God and of the Church, hoping to gain a charter of freedom for the free preaching of the gospel in every city of the whole empire. To gain this charter, his rights as a Roman citizen and as a member of the governing aristocracy of the Roman world formed the apparent means. Only as a Roman could he be sent up to the imperial tribunal. Accordingly, he adopted at this crisis a different line of conduct from that which he had pursued on his missionary journeys, and in all parts of his life alike he acted with the same noble spirit. Before the Roman journey, Paul had still to undergo one more trial, and to speak in the presence of kings and governors. Agrippa II, with his sister Bernice, came to pay a visit of state to the new governor, and Festus took the opportunity of examining Paul with the assistance of Agrippa's intimate knowledge of Hebrew law and religion. He had to send up a report to the emperor in the case of this prisoner, and he was puzzled to specify correctly the exact nature of the charges, which only a Jew by religion could properly understand. In the examination, Agrippa, as a king, took precedence and conducted the proceedings, while Festus sat beside him. Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. The prisoner, with an orator's gesture, fettered as he was, addressed the king with the dignity and self-possession that was his birthright, without servility and yet with courtly deference, beginning by paying a compliment to the king's familiarity with the customs and questions which are among the Jews, he said only what was true, but he said it with polished and graceful courtesy. Paul's speech included a brief autobiography, in which he touched summarily on the chief events of his life, and more fully, yet still very briefly, on the epoch-making occasion of his conversion. The apparent differences from the accounts given of this critical event in chapters 9 and 22 arise chiefly from the fact that none of the accounts gives every detail, and that different details are mentioned in each case according to the different purpose and emotion of the narrator and the different character of the persons addressed. Here, for example, where Paul was speaking in a Gentile court, he makes no reference to Annise because it would not produce any effect on the audience to hear what part an obscure Jew at Damascus had played in the action, whereas that part of the story was likely to appeal strongly to the Jewish auditors in chapter 22. Paul also laid strong emphasis on the promise of the Messiah, the hope of the 12 tribes, and the fact that this hope can be attained only through the raising of the dead. He first mentions this truth in more general terms early in his speech, and then at a later point expounds the fulfillment of the promise in the death and resurrection of Jesus. This idea of the resurrection seemed so absurd and incredible to the rough and blunt Roman officer that he rudely interrupted the speaker by loudly calling out, "Paul, you may be a great philosopher, but you have no common sense." Festus had no prejudice against Paul, but regarded him with good-humored contempt as an unpractical enthusiast. From the Roman governor, Paul turned with a courteous negative to the king, who knew Judea and what had happened there, and boldly put the question to him whether he, who claimed to be a Jew, believed the prophets. Agrippa did not like the question. He kept his Judaism for the Jews, but was not willing to display it in a Gentile court. He would not answer the question directly, for if he replied in the affirmative, he would incur the ridicule of the Romans, and if he answered in the negative, he would sacrifice his reputation with the Jews. He therefore turned aside the question by a half-jesting, half-ironical remark, "You expect to make a Christian of me in very quick time." The universal opinion of the court was that Paul was not guilty. He might be a harebrained enthusiast, but he was not a criminal, and Agrippa declared that he might have been set at liberty had the case not passed beyond their jurisdiction through the prisoner's appeal to Caesar. Thus it came about that, instead of being released, Paul, though practically acquitted, was through his own demand sent on to bear witness also at Rome. The emphatic declaration of Paul's innocence with which the long proceedings in Palestine ended is noteworthy. Luke is careful to record that time after time the Roman officials, such as Gallio, justified Paul and took his part against the Jews. And he alone among the evangelists records Pilate's thrice-repeated statement acquitting Jesus of all faults before the law, whereas Mark omits it wholly. John and Matthew mention only one occasion. End of section 44. Read by John R. Moore, Albertville, Alabama, December 2022. Section 45 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. Paul takes command when danger threatens. Acts 27, 1 through 26. When the decision had been ratified by the agreement of the Roman procurator and the Jewish king that Paul's appeal to the supreme imperial tribunal must be accepted and his case sent on to Rome for judgment, it is evident that no further time was lost. Festus had reached Palestine probably early in the summer, but the process had dragged on for some considerable time, and the autumn was now approaching or perhaps had begun. The lateness of the season affected the choice of route. The quickest and least fatiguing way was by sea, but for many months between late autumn and early spring, long voyages ceased, and what may be called ocean-going ships lay up, though there was no season when ships could not be hired to take short voyages, watching for a fair opportunity. During the season when distant navigation was avoided, the journey from the east to Rome was performed by land, through Galatia, Asia, Philippi, and Thessalonica. On these customs in regard to the way of traveling, the whole of Paul's voyage turned. The end of the settled season, when the Mediterranean is continuously suited for sailing vessels, was close at hand, and there was every probability that the land route would have to be chosen for part of the way. The centurion Julius, into whose charge Paul was put with a number of other prisoners, took passage in a ship bound for Adramyttium on the coast of Asia. If no better opportunity occurred by the way, it would be easy to get a passage across to Neapolis, chapter 16, verse 11, and thence the convoy would take the land route. The other prisoners were, as a rule, doubtless criminals who were being taken to Rome to amuse by their death in the arena the idle populace, habituated to enjoy such cruel sights. Few persons had, like Paul, the distinction of being remitted for trial to the highest court of the empire. The prevailing winds on the open Mediterranean throughout the summer are westerly, favoring the voyage from Italy to Egypt and Syria, but making the return voyage difficult. The only way to sail from Caesarea to Italy or to Adramyttium was to keep close to the coast and take advantage of the local breezes to dodge along from point to point as a chance occurred. Such voyages were often extremely slow, and at the best many days and much patience were needed to reach the southwestern corner of Asia Minor. In the harbor of Myra, the Lycian city, there happened a favorable chance. One of the large ships which carried corn, verse 38, from Egypt to feed the vast population of the great city of Rome had put in there, and the centurion seized the opportunity and transferred his whole company of prisoners and guards to this vessel, which was sailing direct to Puteoli on the west coast of Italy, the harbor of Rome. The course of this ship would coincide with that of the other as far as Cnidus, but the Egyptian corn vessels were the largest and best equipped at the time. This vessel was for some reason belated, and had not accompanied the Egyptian fleet, which sailed in a great body for Puteoli earlier in the year. The winds continued adverse, and many days elapsed before Cnidus, a promontory on the southwest of Asia Minor, was reached. Hence the vessel would in ordinary course have run across the Aegean Sea, north of Crete, to the southern point of Greece, but strong north winds were blowing, and there was danger that the ship might be driven on the north coast of Crete, where there are hardly any harbors except Suda Bay. Accordingly, they ran for shelter under the south coast of Crete, and again began the process of slowly making their way westward from point to point as far as Fair Havens, a harbor near the middle of the long Cretan southern shore. Here Paul advised that they should lay up for the winter, as the middle of October was now on them. Julius had from the outset treated Paul with great courtesy, because the latter was a person of distinction, not a criminal, and hence the rather strange situation that a prisoner should be offering advice about the conduct of a Roman officer and the management of the ship. Naturally and reasonably, the officer preferred to be guided by the captain and the sailing master, and chose on their advice to pass the winter season further west in the harbor called Phoenix. It was now accepted by all that it was too late to tempt the open sea, and that the winter must be spent in a Cretan port, but Phoenix was the one preferred in such cases, as we know from an inscription recording the detention there of another vessel of the same class, and the navigating authorities thought that they could reach it safely. To us it seems strange that the decision should lie with the soldier and not with the sailors, but the centurion traveling on the emperor's service commanded even the captain. Taking advantage one day of a gentle south wind, they sailed from Fair Havens. Close to the west lay a prominent cape which they had to pass, and it was not quite certain that they could round it with the wind from the south. Paul and Luke were on deck watching, and doubtless all the sailors and prisoners were doing the same. It was an anxious voyage at that late season, and there was the danger that the south wind might cast them on shore. Luke says that they were close inshore. The record of such a detail reflects the anxiety felt at this moment by one who knew what Paul's advice had been. They passed the Cape, and then they had to run to Phoenix across a great bay, where they were much further from shore. Then the southerly breeze suddenly changed to a north-northeast gale, a change which is frequent on that coast. So strong was the wind that the ship could not keep her course, but had to run before it, thus getting dangerously far out to sea in this stormy season. A modern sailing ship prefers the open sea, but ancient vessels were not so strongly built, and were fitted with one mast and one huge sail, which strained the hull so severely as often to cause leaks and foundering. The little boat, which in calm weather was towed behind the stern, was now hauled on board with difficulty. Another danger threatened. The gale was blowing the ship direct toward the African quicksands. They therefore lowered the yard, and under a little sail with prow turned up towards the wind, drifted westward for 14 days. The ship was leaking, and everything that could be thrown overboard was sacrificed to keep her afloat. In this time of fear, Paul cheered the ship's company by telling of the vision which he had, in which God promised that all on board should be saved. It is noteworthy that in Fair Havens he intimated that there would be much loss of life. Luke does not hesitate to record on that occasion a forecast that proved incorrect. Even Paul could be mistaken, and only through direct revelation did he learn the truth. Now, in the time of despair and despondency, Paul alone stands out to encourage the crew and to rouse all on board to exert themselves and save themselves. The centurion and the captain pass out of notice, and Paul issues orders. End of section 45, read by John R. Moore, Albertville, Alabama, December 2022. Section 46 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. Paul, the Savior of his companions, Acts 27:27 through 28:10. In the 14th night, as they drifted over the sea Adria, the quick sense of the sailors made them aware that land was near, and soundings showed first a depth of 20 and soon afterwards of 15 fathoms. They therefore anchored by the stern to avoid running on shore in the dark, and prayed for day. The sailors now got out the boat, pretending to be about to lay out anchors from the prow, but really intending to make their escape. But Paul, perceiving their intention, warned the centurion and the soldiers, who cut the boat adrift. At daybreak, when the time for exertion was approaching and strength was needed, Paul entreated all to take food, and set the example himself. The terms in which his hurried meal is described are evidently chosen to suggest the Eucharist. When he had taken bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he brake it. While it was not in the strict sense a celebration of the sacrament, since almost the whole company were pagans, Luke felt that there was power and blessing in the act. Thus all were encouraged to eat. The total number of persons on board was 276. The convoy of prisoners must have been large, and the crew in one of the great corn ships was also numerous. This shows that not the entire crew, but merely one lot of sailors, had been guilty of the cowardly action of attempting to desert the ship. As the daylight broke, they saw before them an unknown shore, a bay with a sandy beach in one part, and they resolved to run on the beach, casting off the anchors, unfastening the 2 rudders, which had been lashed up during the night, and hoisting a small foresail to enable them to beach the ship on the most suitable spot. This spot, as they came closer, was seen to be a bank where 2 seas met, i.e., where a narrow spit of land stretches out from the main island towards a small island, which protects the bay on the west, leaving a narrow channel between the sea on one side and the sea on the other side. On the extremity of this spit, they struck a muddy bottom, into which the prow fixed itself, while the stern was free and beaten by the waves until it began to break up. From this place all got safe ashore in one way or another. The soldiers who were responsible with their lives if the prisoners escaped wished to kill them all, but the centurion, desirous of saving Paul, permitted them all to land. Beyond this single reference, Luke takes no notice of the other prisoners during the voyage. This narrative of the voyage and shipwreck has been almost universally recognized as the most vivid and trustworthy account of ancient seamanship that has been preserved, one that could only have been given by an eyewitness and a faithful and accurate observer. We notice that the direct revelation of the divine will to Paul plays an important part in the action, and there cannot be any doubt that the revelation was one great cause why Luke was so interested in the story as to relate it with this fullness of detail. In virtue of this revelation, Paul is depicted on a higher level than ordinary men, advising more skillfully than the sailors, maintaining hope and courage when all were in despair, playing the part of a true Roman in a Roman ship, reverenced even by the Roman officer, and in his single self the Savior of all. Here is a picture such as Luke loves to paint of the triumph of spiritual over material strength. Even Roman soldiers, the best in the world, lost courage, and were saved by the courage of Paul. Further, Luke describes the voyage at such length in order to concentrate attention on this part of Paul's career. Paul was now about to stand his trial, and the result of his trial before the Supreme Court of the Empire was that he was acquitted, and a decisive verdict was thus pronounced in favor of free teaching of the Christian faith. Subsequently, after the verdict was recalled and persecution became the lot of all Christians, Luke recorded the facts of the earlier period when the Holy Spirit had guided the church to that great acquittal. The company, now safe on the shore, which, as they soon learned, was the island of Malta, were kindly treated by the rude natives, who kindled a fire for them. Paul, always helpful, gathered an armful of brushwood and was throwing it on the fire when a snake, roused by the heat, came out of the sticks and fastened on his hand, clinging there until Paul shook it off into the fire. This action shows that the snake was a constrictor and not, as Luke calls it, a viper, which does not occur in Malta. There is found in the island a species of constrictor, in scientific classification either Coronella austriaca or Leopardinus. Observers differ as to the exact species, which is in appearance so like a viper as to deceive even a skilled naturalist unless he examines it closely. And the action of this species would be exactly what Luke describes. It has teeth and bites, but the teeth are so small as hardly to draw blood. The natives thought the snake was venomous and expected to see Paul die in torture. Such belief in the venomous nature of really harmless animals is extremely common among rude peoples. They began to moralize on the justice of God, which had singled out this man among the prisoners. He must have been a murderer who deserved to die. The other prisoners could not be so wicked as he was, and though he had escaped the sea, yet divine justice was now punishing his crime. But when time passed, and no harm happened to the supposed murderer, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Thus Paul's personality dominated all with whom he was brought in contact. The spiritual power was so manifest in him that even the rude natives recognized it. The leading man of the island, one Publius, entertained the company hospitably. He would, of course, make some distinction, and would pay much more attention to the Roman officer and the captain than to the common soldiers, and more to the soldiers than to the prisoners. But Paul was treated among the distinguished guests, and Luke was with him. Either the courtesy that the centurion had all along shown him, or the reputation he had acquired as a god, procured for Paul this special treatment. In return, Paul visited the father of Publius, who was sick of a fever, and after prayer laid his hands on him and healed him. Thereupon other invalids came from all parts of the island and received medical attention. Luke the physician took part in the treatment of these invalids and shared in the honors that were bestowed on Paul. We understand why Paul was everywhere treated with such attentive courtesy, but why was Luke admitted to participate in it and to be everywhere in close company with a prisoner? It was contrary to the Roman custom to permit any friend to accompany a prisoner on his way to Rome. In one famous case, even a wife was not permitted to accompany her husband, a Roman noble, when he was carried a prisoner to Rome, and she had to hire a vessel to follow him. The only way in which Luke could be allowed to accompany Paul and to always be close to him was that he was understood to be a slave attending on his master, Paul. The relation between master and slave was close and familiar, and often very affectionate, and it was natural and permissible that a confidential slave should attend Paul everywhere. We notice two marks of accurate detail. One, the sea between Crete and Malta is called Adria, i.e. Adriatic. That was true to sailors' language, and the name Adriatic was even extended to include all the sea as far as Cyprus on the east and the African coast on the south. 2. Publius is called the first man of the island. This was the technical name for the head man in Malta, as we know from inscriptions. End of section 46. Read by John R. Moore, Albertville, Alabama, December 2022. Section 47 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching, by William M. Ramsay. A Last Appeal to the Jews, Acts 28, verses 11 through 31. At the earliest moment possible, after spending the 3 months of midwinter in Malta, the convoy of prisoners sailed for Rome. The regular season for navigation had not yet begun, but even in winter it was always possible to take advantage of fair wind and weather, and to sail from point to point as occasion presented itself. Especially this was the case with the large corn vessels which maintained the service between Alexandria and Rome. Such ships were used to long voyages across the open sea, and it was important that they should reach Puteoli, the harbor for Rome, as early as possible. The centurion found one of the corn ships which had been driven out of its normal course by the autumn storms, just like his previous vessel, but had escaped shipwreck and spent the winter in a Maltese harbor. On a favorable opportunity, this ship sailed north to the coast of Sicily. It was detained 3 days in Syracuse. It reached the Straits of Messina with a wind that was not quite favorable and required careful navigation. It was detained 1 day in the harbor of Rhegium. Then a south wind sprang up, blowing fair for their destination. Thus, after 1 whole day and part of the next spent in the long run across the open sea, they reached Puteoli, the great harbor of Campania and of the whole Italian west coast, where all the Alexandrian ships discharged their cargo of corn for transport to Rome by land. The centurion's courtesy allowed Paul 7 days' rest in Puteoli. The voyage on an ancient ship was rather trying at the best of times, as none of the comforts which modern vessels offer were available for ordinary passengers. People slept hard, and fared poorly, and once Tacitus tells that a regiment of Roman soldiers, after the long voyage to Egypt and back, was disabled for a time from active service, even on an occasion of utmost need. In Puteoli, the harbor for the east, strangers from Syria, Palestine, etc. were numerous, and here the new religion had established itself. Paul enjoyed the hospitality of the brethren until the journey to Rome was made. He was expected there. His letter to the Romans, written from Corinth 3 years ago, had intimated his intention of visiting the capital of the world, and many of the numerous friends with whom he had come in contact during his wandering life found their way to Rome on business or duty. Now, considering the situation, it seems beyond doubt that a report of the case, with reasons for sending on the appeal to the Supreme Court, must have been dispatched by Festus to Rome. The report would have been sent by imperial courier along the land route. With a fortunate voyage, the centurion would have reached Rome before the courier, and probably a copy of the report was sent in his charge. But as it happened, the courier must have arrived long before the centurion. Further, there can be no doubt that the brethren in Rome were in communication with those in the East, and heard from time to time of Paul's fate. The sympathetic interest between the scattered congregations, which was caused by such frequent communication, was the main support of unity, the very lifeblood of the church. Accordingly, when a message from Puteoli brought private news to the brethren in Rome that Paul had reached Italy, many of them started to welcome him on the way. Some of these eager friends met him at the Marcotte of Appius, 43 miles from Rome, some at the Three Shops, about 33 miles. The sight of those friendly faces cheered Paul, and he thanked God. In spite of alleviating circumstances and the divine encouragement, the strain and hardship of the voyage must have told on his delicate frame, and physical weakness caused low spirits. We see in his letters written from Rome plain signs how much his nature longed for sympathetic friends, and we can imagine the joy which he felt when his Roman friends, some known to him of old, some new, greeted his arrival in these two wayside towns. On reaching Rome, Paul rested 3 days. Such a long holiday is a plain proof of his fatigue and weakness, and then invited the principal Jews to the house which he had hired, and where he lived under the guard of a soldier. He explained his case to them in as polite a way as was consistent with truth. He was delivered to the Romans. He avoids saying that the Jews did this. The Roman authorities found him innocent and wished to release him. Then, as the Jews opposed his release, he had been forced to appeal to Caesar, but not in any spirit of revenge or accusation against his nation. And now, having come to Rome, his first act was to entreat his own people to speak with him. The promise made by God to his people, the hope of his people, drove him on into imprisonment, into chains, and now to entreat the Jews in Rome. They answered that they knew nothing about the case. It is impossible to believe that they spoke the whole truth, but they were evidently nonplussed at this unexpected situation and astounded at the devotion of Paul to his cause and to his nation. The man whom the Jews had sought to kill first with their hands, afterwards with all the weapons of legal procedure, felt no bitterness against his persecutors. They sought to kill him. He only sought in return to save them. These Roman Jews began to wonder whether they had heard all the truth. They would not betray their own people, but for the present would merely listen to what Paul had to say for himself. They denied that they had received any letter from Judea about him. It is hard to believe that this can be true. The statement is probably an evasion to which some color of justification could be given in a sidelong fashion. They denied that any of their nation had reported or spoken any harm of Paul. This is even harder to credit. Many a pilgrim must have returned and told the tale in Rome, but in some evasive way also they could maintain that no harm had been told of Paul. They acknowledged that they had heard much about the new sect on all hands, and that the accounts were all hostile, but they were prepared to hear from Paul himself what he had to say in its defense. They made no allusion to the existence of Christians in Rome, yet they must have been well aware that a Roman congregation existed and that people of their nation belonged to it. The whole brief reply is evasive, false, and superficially polite. Luke felt this. He will not point it out any more than he would draw attention to the incorrectness of the tribune's statement in chapter 23, verse 27. That was not his method. He states the facts simply and accurately and expects his readers to understand the situation as he knew it. On an appointed day, many Jews came to Paul's house, and he spent the whole day setting before them the facts about Jesus, proving from Moses and the prophets that he was the promised Messiah. The result was the usual one. Some believed, and some disbelieved. The audience departed, and Paul, quoting the words of Isaiah, recognized his failure with the Jews, but added that the Gentiles would hear. The second book of Luke's history ends with this intimation and the general statement that the apostle continued to preach in his own dwelling freely and boldly for 2 whole years. End of section 47. Read by John R. Moore, Albertville, Alabama, December 2022.
Section 48 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. Weakness Made Strong. The Autobiography of a Missionary. 2 Corinthians 11:18 to 12:10. In his second letter to the Corinthians, protesting against the low opinion which his detractors expressed of him, Paul introduces a short sketch of his own career, prefacing it with an apology for the appearance of egotism and self-glorification which autobiography necessarily wears. He will describe his own life only because his opponents compel him to describe his services. His detractors compared him unfavorably with certain Jewish teachers who had come from Palestine to Corinth. Paul makes the comparison also and gives it a very different color. He is as truly a Hebrew, an Israelite, and heir of the promise as they. He is far more truly a minister of Christ than they, for he had suffered imprisonment, personal chastisement, and risk of death in a way with which they could not compare. He had been 5 times beaten by his Jewish countrymen. These beatings are not mentioned by Luke, but both in Palestine and elsewhere, the Jewish communities exercised justice according to their own law on their own people within certain limits. He had been 3 times beaten with the rods of Roman lictors. This might occur either in a Roman colony or in any place where he came in contact with a Roman governor. In Philippi alone is such beating recorded, but the persecution and expulsion which he endured in the colonies of Antioch and Lystra might well be accompanied with beating. 3 times he had suffered shipwreck, and on one of these occasions he had been in the water for a day and a night. These are not mentioned in the Acts. This letter was written before the period described in 24 and following. In his long missionary journeys he had been exposed to many dangers, from flooded rivers, from robbers in cities and in deserts and at sea, from foreigners and Jews, and even worst of all, from pretended Christians. He had suffered from fatigue and hard work, from want of sleep and food and drink and clothes, from cold and abstinence. The greatest trial of all was the ceaseless anxiety about his young churches, which always pressed heavy on his heart. He sympathized with all, suffered in their sufferings, denied himself the freedom of life to which he was entitled, because some weak and over-scrupulous Christians thought that such freedom of conduct was wrong, and was heartbroken when any of his converts failed in their Christian life. In his weakness he had been saved by the power of God, as when he fled from the governor of Damascus, and was saved not through his courage, but in the refuge of a basket hanging from a wall. The crowning honor of his career lay in the direct communion with God which had been granted to him. This was a private experience, which lay between him and God, and which in ordinary circumstances he would shrink from mentioning to men. Even to speak of such favors as had been bestowed on him in this way savors of boastfulness. But he speaks now under compulsion. In a vision 14 years ago he had been transported into heaven. He had heard what he could not repeat. He did not himself fully comprehend what had happened, whether his body was thus caught up, or whether the spirit was set free from the body for a time and enabled to commune with God. Perhaps it was not the man, but the spirit alone, that had seen or heard what occurred in paradise. Of such honor, in some way that he could not define or describe, he had been found worthy. It was through his weakness that he was made strong and exalted to honor. He therefore feels justified in glorying in his weakness, because through his weakness he was more fitted to exhibit the power of God, which acted through him and made use of him for great purposes, far beyond his own poor strength to carry into effect. It has sometimes been thought by modern writers that Luke lays too much stress on the actions and sufferings of Paul. But this account given by the apostle himself shows that Luke was reticent and had passed lightly and silently over much that had befallen him. We can only conjecture as to the occasions when many of these events happened, and we cannot fit them exactly into his life. As to the great vision, it was a secret of Paul's spiritual life, mentioned only through this accidental cause. Yet he dates it to a year, a thing that he very rarely does. It occurred in the 14th year before he was writing. The epistle was written in the year 56 to 57, that is, the year beginning, according to Corinthian custom, in autumn 56, and the 14th year before that, according to the ancient way of counting, was 43-44. In that year Paul had gone to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and had a vision in the temple in which he was ordered to go away and begin his mission to the Gentiles. May we not connect the account given to the Corinthians with the other account given in the speech to the Jews, and believe that the order was accompanied with some marvelous revelation regarding the purpose of God about which he could not speak to men. That this was so suits well with the next words, lest Paul should become proud through the consciousness of this great revelation. His weakness was brought home to him by the disease from which he soon began to suffer, and which kept always before his mind the knowledge that he could do nothing through his own strength. This disease, the stake in the flesh which showed the power of Satan over him, began to afflict him not long after he left Jerusalem on that occasion, and, as seems probable, it seized upon him in Pamphylia. But this weakness was the cause of the marvelous success which was granted him immediately afterwards in Galatia. He visited Galatia on account of it, and there he gained the first comprehensive victory in his missionary career. God's power was made perfect in Paul's weakness. Such seems the thought in this part of the autobiography, and the other autobiography contained in the epistle to the Galatians ought to be carefully compared with it. Each throws light on the other in instructive fashion, and the nature of Paul's mind is set before us by the two accounts written at different times and in different states of feeling. But in both there is one character. Nothing seems of value to Paul in his past history except his relation to God. All else sinks into insignificance in his retrospect. There is nothing real in the world except the divine. All else is error and illusion. The greatest things are done through man's weakness. The silence of God shouts aloud among men, to adapt the striking language of Ignatius. The greatest of saints is in himself, as Paul says about himself to Timothy, the chief of sinners. End of section 48. Section 49 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching, by William M. Ramsay. The Law of Spiritual Compensation, 2 Corinthians 8. In his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul pleads for a liberal contribution to the fund which he was anxious that all his young Gentile churches should send to relieve the poor Christians in Jerusalem. In sections 36 and 37, the purpose of this contribution, viz., to foster and strengthen the feeling of unity between the Jewish and Gentile congregations, was fully described, and the importance attached to it by Paul was explained. In his first letter, written from Ephesus, a good deal more than a year previously, 16:1 and following, he had commended this contribution to their attention, quoting the example of the Galatian churches, and had advised them to lay by every Sunday a proportion of their earnings, so that when he arrived no time need be spent in gathering contributions, and there should be no occasion for him to solicit donations, but the whole matter should proceed from their voluntary action in storing up their weekly subscriptions. Titus, who had visited them in the interval, had again recommended the subject to them. Now, during A.D. 56, Paul once more, in view of Titus's approaching second visit, urges them to have everything completed and ready. It is interesting to observe the arguments by which, not directly, but only indirectly, he solicits their contributions. He desired that the collection should be voluntary, but the idea of charitable giving, now so familiar to every Protestant congregation, was then entirely new, and it was necessary to mention the subject and make the reasons plain to these recently converted pagans of Corinth. He first quotes the example of the Macedonian churches, Philippi, which was always generous, Philippians 4:16, Thessalonica, Berea, and possibly other more recent foundations, Romans 15:19. The Macedonians, who were tried and proved in the furnace of suffering for their faith, showed their happiness in the Christian life amid their deep poverty and giving most liberally. Up to and almost beyond the limits of their power, they contributed voluntarily and unsolicited, even begging to be allowed the opportunity of showing their appreciation of the graces and of joining in the work of helping their fellow Christians. They not merely gave what Paul had hoped for, viz., money, but they gave themselves in whole-hearted devotion. Titus is now about to visit Corinth again, and Paul trusts that he will carry to completion this gracious act on the part of the Corinthians as successfully as he had done his work on his first visit, and hopes that they will show themselves as abundant in the grace of charitable giving as they were richly endowed in respect of faith and power of expressing their inspired thoughts and knowledge of the truth, and eager devotion, and finally in love for Paul. The apostle does not order them to make a contribution. He wishes that their actions and their gifts should proceed from their own sense of what was right, and from the generous impulses of their own heart. He only mentions the example set by the generosity of the Macedonian churches as a test by which the sincerity of the love which the Corinthians felt might be tried. Then follows one of the most noteworthy sentences in the whole of Paul's writings. In 8:9, we have one of the clearest and most indubitable declarations of the pre-existence of Jesus as God before he condescended to take on himself human form. This is the doctrine which John states with special emphasis. The Word was in the beginning with God. The Word was God. The Word became flesh and dwelt among men. Paul here has the same thought in his mind, and quotes it as a higher example than the Macedonian churches for Corinth to follow. Jesus voluntarily gave up the riches of his existence and divine power in heaven, and took on him the poverty and humbleness of human nature, that the Corinthians, through his poverty of life on earth and his death, might attain to the spiritual riches of salvation. A third argument addressed to the reasoning powers of the Corinthians, on which they rather prided themselves, is that they made a beginning of this collecting in the preceding year, and did so willingly. As they began, it is only reasonable that they complete their own undertaking. It is irrational to begin any enterprise and stop halfway. If they are now suffering from poverty, and had trade and loss of profits, they can, of course, give only in proportion to their means at the moment. Paul advises all men to give only according to what they actually possess, and not as lavishly as if they were wealthy. It is not according to the will of God, or the dictates of reason and justice, to indulge in the false generosity of giving away what one does not really possess, that is, giving at the expense of others. True charity consists in giving what one possesses of one's own. Nor ought one to give away all that one possesses, and thus reduce himself to penury and become an object of charity to others. To do that only adds to the burden which the congregation has to support. True religious feeling is rational and sensible, and does not squander all that it has. It thinks and reasons and estimates how much it can do, and in what way it can make the best use of its resources for the benefit of all. At the same time, the standard of giving should lie in a certain balance and equality. If the Corinthians now give of their abundance to the struggling and poverty-stricken brethren in Jerusalem, the time may come when the latter will have the opportunity from their abundance of helping the Corinthians on some occasion when they are afflicted. Thus the Church of God lives as a single body, all of whose parts are nourished equally and equally healthy, not all doing the same work, but having all their separate duties and functions, each cooperating with the other, each aiding the other, and so all maintaining a harmonious and equable life of strenuous activity. This healthy condition of the body and of the congregation implies that no part and no person should retain a superabundance. Each has what is fair and suitable to maintain efficient work. The case of the healthy church is similar to what is told in the Old Testament about the congregation of the Hebrews gathering manna for their daily food. No one gained anything by gathering a superabundant store, for he found that nothing remained over after satisfying the wants of his family and himself. And on the other hand, if anyone found it out of his power to gather a large amount, what he did collect always proved sufficient. So in the life of the Christian congregation, he that gathers a superabundant store and tries to hoard it will find that he gains nothing from it. If the church is in proper health, each part supplies the other. Such is the law of spiritual compensation. Through the operation of this law, great charitable organizations have been built by voluntary, unsolicited contributions. Such are, for example, the China Inland Mission and Couriers' Homes for Orphan and Destitute Children, neither of which has ever sent out any request for aid or for subscriptions. Each has been created by faith and prayer. End of section 49. Section 50 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. Paul's Last Will and Testament, 2 Timothy 4, 1-18. A pathetic interest, apart from their intrinsic value, is given to the words of this passage from Paul's last letter, by circumstances in which they were written. Paul's second trial in Rome before the Supreme Court had begun. The first hearing was over, and the final stage was postponed for a time. Although the first stage had been successfully passed, yet he had no expectation that the final result would be equally favorable. He felt that the time had come when he must leave his work on earth. His life was already being poured out as an offering to God. Years had now elapsed since the time which is indicated. In the interval, Paul's first trial had been successfully surmounted. He had revisited the Hellenic churches round the shores of the Aegean Sea. He had written 1 Timothy and Titus. He had been arrested by Roman command and brought to the capital of the empire for trial. At the same time, the final stage of the trial was not immediately imminent. It had been postponed, and the probable reason for this long delay is that witnesses were to be brought from the scenes of Paul's work in the East, or investigations made there as to its character and effect. Thus arises the double tone in this chapter. It contains instructions to Timothy as to his conduct and work after his master's death, and yet it urges him repeatedly to come to see Paul in Rome, a long journey which might take from 1 to 3 months according to the route, and to bring with him books and comforts for use in the winter season. The interest of this passage for us lies mainly in the former point of view. It is the last message of a man who felt that death was approaching. It sums up his own work and provides for the continuance of that work when he is gone. Paul's instructions, and as we might almost say, his last will and testament, for the charge which he gives to Timothy is expressed so solemnly and impressively that it might fitly be so called, are characteristic. Paul's sole concern in view of death is that the work be carried on. He foresees what dangers beset the church in the future, because those dangers have already begun. Some are weary of the sound and health-giving doctrine, and their numbers will in the future be much increased. The teaching which imparts health and points the way to salvation is felt to be trite, uninteresting, and old-fashioned, and people are full of curiosity and interest about novelties in teaching. Their ears itch for a more alluring and exciting sort of instruction. They want teachers who will advise them to do what they desire to do, and who will tickle their fancy with quaint and clever, though false philosophical discourses. Such teaching only diverts people from hearing the truth. In opposition to this fatal kind of teaching, Paul urges Timothy to preach the divine message, the true gospel, as he must be judged hereafter, and as he must live now in the sight of God. He should press on the work at all times, not putting off in hope of a more favorable opportunity hereafter, but acting now, whether the moment is favorable or not. He should reprove faults, encourage all to exert themselves, be patient with them, but always teach. He is to take up the work which is now slipping from Paul's hands. In verse 7 there is a figure of speech which is not military, as the usual translation makes it, but connected with athletic contests. I have competed in the honorable contest. I have run the race to the finish. I have observed all the rules of this race course of faith. In the Christian life, the competitor for the prize of righteousness must feel the same intense eagerness and show the same concentration of all his powers on the great effort as are necessary to win the prize in a great race. The prize for the race was in ancient times a garland, and this garland or crown is ready for Paul as the consummation of his intense and strained effort in life. There is, however, one marked difference between the garland offered for an athletic prize and the garland which God, the fair umpire and judge, will award. Only one can gain the prize in an athletic contest, but all can equally gain that prize of a righteous life, if they are animated with the true love for the appearing of Christ and the coming of his kingdom. Verses 1 and 8. Now appears the human side in Paul's nature. He is lonely, except for the companionship of Luke. Several of his assistants he has sent away on mission work, and Demas, a good Christian in the past, has been unable to endure the danger and trials of companionship with Paul, and has gone back to Thessalonica to enjoy comfort and ease at home. Paul has sent Tychicus to Ephesus to relieve Timothy, and set the latter free to come with Mark to Rome before the winter begins. But another also has gone to Ephesus, an enemy and a danger, Alexander, against whom Paul warns Timothy. In the first stage of his trial, no one supported Paul by his presence and countenance. In reading this statement, however, we must remember that only Roman citizens could appear in court to support him. There is no reason to think that Luke was a Roman citizen, except as a freedman, probably, who was not privileged to appear thus in court, or Tychicus. But in the Roman Church there were some citizens who shrank from the trial, and Paul felt their desertion. Yet he pleaded his own cause, with Christ as his supporter, and the divine power had strengthened him so that the cause of the gospel was set forth in the hearing of that great court, the supreme tribunal of the empire, and so much effect was produced that the imminent condemnation was postponed. The result was, indeed, not a complete acquittal, but still it was a great triumph that in such a time of persecution, when trial generally resulted in instant condemnation, further investigation was found necessary, and a long postponement was pronounced for the trial. Paul rejoiced in this result, not because he was afraid of death, but because it implied greater freedom for the Christians and fuller opportunity to preach. We know what was the usual method at that time of executing criminals who were condemned on such charges as were brought against the Christians. They were frequently exposed to be torn and devoured by wild beasts in the amphitheater, or their death was otherwise contrived to be an amusement to the brutal populace of Rome. And the expression which Paul uses, "I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion," was probably suggested by this, though he himself, as a Roman citizen, was privileged to have a more honorable form of death. End of section 50. Section 51 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching by William M. Ramsay. The Epitaph of Paul. 2 Timothy 4:7. These words, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith," are the brief review which Paul, in the anticipation of threatening death, makes of his life and his work. They sum up his whole character. As was stated in section 50, they refer not to warfare, but to competition in athletic sports. The Hellenic peoples, among whom his Gentile churches were founded, were very fond of such sports, which formed a recognized part of the education of every boy, and were carefully regulated under trained medical guidance. Victory in the great international competitions was regarded as the highest of distinctions, not merely for the successful athlete, but for the city to which he belonged. And in that keenly contested arena, victory could be gained only by the most intense and concentrated effort, following on a long preliminary period of training according to very severe rules. The rules of the course and all the preparation for it were rigidly enforced by the judges, who regulated the competition and decided the prize. Competitors who had not strictly complied with all the rules were disqualified remorselessly. To win the prize, not merely must one be first, but one must attain that position in accordance with stern laws and regulations. In a series of metaphors drawn from this side of Hellenic life, Paul finds the description which will best explain to his readers, not merely Timothy, but all the Ephesian church, the intensity and long course of concentrated application which characterized his life and the life of every Christian. "I have competed in the honorable contest. I have run the race to the winning post. I have observed the rules which regulate the race course of faith." Paul was the typical man, the typical human Christian. Our life, just like his, must be one long struggle onwards towards a goal. We can maintain the strength only by strict discipline and the observing of all the rules, as he did. We reach the goal and win the prize only in the hour of death, as he reached it. The struggle ends only with our life. It must be maintained to the end. The prize is not in this life or of this life, but it can be won by all who persevere to the last. Such is the whole life of Paul. He was an eager competitor from the beginning to the end. Before he learned what Christ was, when he hated him, he persecuted all his followers. He was already struggling on in his ignorance and blindness towards the knowledge of God and of truth. He was even then a leader of men, a preacher, a missionary, eagerly bent on bringing others to the truth as he believed it. On the road to Damascus, near that city, he saw with his own eyes the Jesus still living, whom he had believed to be a dead impostor. The direction of his efforts was changed from that time onwards. He knew now where the truth lay, and the same devouring enthusiasm, the same concentrated energy which he had before ignorantly applied in a misdirected course, he now applied to the spreading of his better knowledge. He had to face a constant succession of difficulties, as we must in our life. He was always misunderstood and suspected by many, as the strenuous reformer will always be. But he always found devoted and zealous friends, as the true and honest seeker after knowledge always finds them. Friends ready to guarantee his honesty with their credit and their life, ready to believe in him even when appearances were against him, and to help him in all his difficulties. All men who work unselfishly for the good of the world, all who try to achieve something noble and generous in their life, all who live for a high ideal, will turn with growing interest and admiration to the career of Paul, and will find mirrored in it the best side of their own nature. When he first came to Jerusalem after his conversion, the disciples were afraid of him, for they could not believe in his truth. Barnabas helped him, became his champion, and guaranteed his good faith. Then he disputed against the Hellenist Jews, his own former friends, since he too was a Hellenist Jew. But they went about to slay him. He had to flee from Jerusalem. He lived many years a life that was undistinguished, while he was learning the Christian missionary's life by living it, the only way in which it can be learned. This was his apprenticeship, in which there seems to have been little apparent external success, for Luke records nothing. At last Barnabas brought him to Antioch, and there he found friends and associates, but still he ranked last among the Antiochian leaders. He was then sent forth by the Spirit along with Barnabas to a new work in the West, and in the prosecution of this work he had to part from that dear and tried friend who was not prepared to do all that Paul believed necessary for success in their joint career. He had to choose between his work and companionship with his best friend. He chose his work, but the cost was great. This is the sorest trial of human life. It is not only our unsympathetic opponents who misunderstand us. Sometimes even our friends differ from us, disagree with our views, suspect and disapprove of our aims and course of life, and part from us. We have to choose between friendship and truth, the hardest choice in life. Are we quite sure that we are right in our view? May we not have mistaken our course? Shall we be justified in breaking the bond of true companionship? With that question comes doubt and anxiety, perplexity, and almost despair. As we see that Paul's life mirrors our trials and struggles, so also we may hope to gain of his consolations and rewards. He attained to many revelations of the nature and will of God. In those revelations he found the highest glory of his earthly life. They were a sacred possession of which he could not speak much, but which he kept deep hidden in his heart. We are not denied such revelations. We, too, may have moments of insight and inspiration in which we attain to direct communion with the divine nature and to sympathy with the purpose and will of God, moments in which the truth seems to unveil itself to our gaze. Those moments are brief and interrupted. We cannot remain long on that high level, but we see that to Paul also those moments of inspiration were discontinuous. The prize, the crown of life, came to him only with death. While we see in Paul the man who struggled through error towards truth, we recognize in him also the highest type of man. We never understand him until we begin to judge his conduct on the highest plane of human action. If we look on him from this point of view, then the longer we study him, the better we appreciate the loftiness of his motives, his unselfishness, his noble and generous spirit in judging the world, his frankness in condemning all wrongdoing and wrong thinking, his courtesy and delicate consideration for the feelings of others, his patience in pleading with them. End of section 51.
Section 52 of Pictures of the Apostolic Church. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pictures of the Apostolic Church, Its Life and Teaching, by William M. Ramsay. Review of the influence of local circumstances on the life of Paul. Tarsus lay in the lowlands of Cilicia, less than 80 feet above the level of the sea, from which it was distant about 10 miles down the river Cydnus. The Cydnus has now changed its course and flows east of, instead of through, the city, and only small boats can cross the bar and enter the river. Careful engineering operations were needed to keep the channel clear and deep, so that ships could sail up into the heart of Tarsus, and a lagoon, through which the river flowed before reaching the sea, was embanked and made useful as the principal harbour and arsenal of the city. Moreover, a road was cut and built to the north over the Taurus Mountains, and the Cilician gates were open to trade. Thus, through the energy, forethought, and skill of its inhabitants, Tarsus was placed at the point where sea-going ships could best profit by the trade which poured down from Central Asia Minor toward the nearest and easiest outlet. This advantage, we must note, was not the free gift of nature, but was gained by the application of knowledge and hard work. The country has now relapsed into its natural condition and is dreary, repellent, and in large part marshy, but by draining and by navigation works on the river, a great extent of fertile soil was formerly made available for agriculture. The ancient accounts tell with what pride the Tarsians regarded their river. It was not beautiful, and strangers who sailed up to Tarsus could only wonder at the Tarsian feeling, but the people loved it because it was, so to say, their own offspring, created by their skill and energy. They had transformed a dreary stretch of half-inundated lands, fringed by sand-heaps on the shore, into a rich plain, holding in its bosom a great city through which ran a river able to float the merchandise of many lands, a city with its feet resting on a great inland harbour and its head reaching up to the hills. The pride of the Tarsians in their city, noted by ancient travellers, was deep-rooted in their nature, and it appears in Paul at one of the most dangerous moments of his life, when, bruised, beaten, and at the point of death, he was barely rescued from a fanatical Jewish mob by Roman soldiers. At that moment, when his life was dependent on the discipline of the soldiers and on the goodwill of their commander, we cannot suppose that in answering the hurried questions put to him, he would indulge in mere picturesque details. He said, "I am a Jew, a Tarsian of Cilicia, citizen of no mean city." In that scene, Paul showed extraordinary courage and coolness, and seized the first possible opportunity to address the mob which a few minutes before had been tearing him in pieces. But the fact that he called himself not a Roman, as he did immediately after, using the title which was most honourable and most likely to move the tribune, but a Tarsian, and praised the importance of Tarsus, cannot be satisfactorily explained except because he shared in the feelings of the Tarsians, among whom he had been born and educated. In modern times a Jew may be a patriotic Frenchman or a good Englishman according to his birth, and yet remain a convinced and loyal Jew, and there is no reason except modern prejudice to think it anything but natural that Paul should entertain a deep and tender feeling for the home of his childhood, in which his family had held an honourable place for generations. To his Tarsian education also, Paul owed it that he could move in Hellenic society at his ease, comprehending and adapting himself to it as one to the manner born, knowing instinctively what Hellenes thought and felt and desired. He was never quite a foreigner among the Hellenes. This was an immense advantage in the Hellenic world, and fitted him to be the apostle of the cities round the Aegean Sea. Moreover, he was born a Roman citizen with all the privileges of the race that governed the world. Several times, in occasions of need, this privilege, which belonged only to a few distinguished Tarsian families, helped him to triumph over apparently insuperable difficulties. It gave him the right to appeal to the emperor, and thus to bear witness also at Rome, and to stand before Caesar, and it qualified him to look forward to preaching the gospel even in Spain, where he must speak in Latin, and to aspire to conquer not merely the Hellenic East, but also the Latin West. Thus, even before his birth, he had been fitted by the circumstances of his family and ancestry to be the apostle of the Gentiles, Galatians 1 verse 5, to interpret to the outer world the religion that had been nursed among the Jews. There is no good missionary who does not often feel how hard it is to comprehend the foreign people whom he addresses, and what difficulty is thrown in his path by the fact that he is a stranger to the heart and thoughts and hopes of his hearers. Paul was free from this difficulty, and his freedom from it is conspicuous in many scenes of his life. It was in Tarsus, too, that he had learnt to understand the popular paganism, to know that there were certain fundamental ideas of good, Romans 2 verse 14 and following, amid the vast edifice of abomination that overspread and concealed the good, and to hate with the whole passionate fervour of his mind the idolatry, the false conception of God's nature, which had destroyed the possibility of improvement and nearer approach to God in the votaries of the Anatolian rites. In Tarsus again, more fully than in any other city, there was a synthesis between Grecian and Oriental manners and ideas. The beginnings had been worked out of a peaceful amalgamation of European and Asiatic in a system that was neither purely Greek nor purely Oriental, Throughout all history, both ancient and modern, the contact and intercourse between the active peoples of the Western and the more receptive Eastern races has stimulated the most fruitful developments of life, but the contact has generally taken the form of war and hatred. In Tarsus, better than in any other ancient city, the problem of cooperation had been solved in a peaceful association of the two elements. Among many signs of the influence exerted on Paul by his Tarsian upbringing, one more may be touched here. It is a fact of human nature that a man can only with difficulty emancipate himself from early prepossessions regarding the conduct of women in society. Paul was accustomed in Tarsus to the complete veiling of women who there walked the streets wholly covered up from view like Turkish ladies in more recent times. In his attitude towards women he moves between two extremes. On the one hand, he knew that in the fully developed Christian church, as it shall be, there is no distinction of nationality or rank or sex, but that all are placed on an equality and made one in Christ. But, on the other hand, he knew only too well that his congregations stood in grave need of improvement, and had not yet risen far above their pagan standard of life. He felt that the reputation of the church in pagan society, as well as its future development, depended largely on the conduct of its women. He was always anxious about them. He was firmly persuaded that it was unwise for Christian women to go far outside of current views as to propriety, and it seems beyond doubt that his early prepossessions influenced in some degree the advice which he gave and the rules that he prescribed about the conduct and the veiling of women. All must feel that he was right in saying that the rule ought to be a mean and balance between the Christian freedom of the future and the conventions of present society, but we must remember that he regarded the present rule as different from the truth of the future. In his early youth, Paul chose his life. There was open to him the career of a citizen in the empire, such as many good Jews as well as bad ones had followed, but he chose the religious life after the type of the old prophets. He would not remain among his Tarsian countrymen, serve the state, marry, and build up his family. He would follow the divine life, and he went to Jerusalem as its proper environment to study the law at the feet of its greatest living teacher. For many years he lived in Jerusalem, and its influence on him was profound. But this influence cannot here be touched, because to touch it is to describe the whole basis of his character. Paul was fundamentally the Hebrew. All other influences were modifying and secondary. They enriched and varied and sweetened the Hebrew type, and hence they can be briefly described. But Jerusalem, first as dreamed of in Tarsus, afterwards as his environment for many years, made the fabric of Paul's mind. Damascus and Arabia touched him, but the next city which strongly influenced him was Syrian Antioch. There, however, it was apparently not the city as a whole, but the Christian congregation and its leaders which moulded him. Contact with the gracious, sympathetic, and generous nature of Barnabas was an education in itself. The other leaders were to him revered figures, to whose example he must mould his conduct. He was still learning. The period for command had not yet begun. In Antioch the church grew among the Gentiles, but did not directly go to them. It welcomed them through the door of the synagogue. Corresponding to this isolation of the church from the city is the faintness of the impression which Antioch makes on the pages of Luke. The congregation and its leaders, a harmonious and impressive body, stand out before us, but no impression of the city is conveyed, except that it was at some distance from the sea, and that Paul went to Seleucia to take ship for Cyprus. Paphos presents itself as the seat of a Roman governor, whose court furnished a memorable scene, a real turning point in Paul's life. Here first he stepped forward as the leader and spoke directly to a Gentile as such. The decisive step was begun and could never be retraced, but its effects were not apparent in Paphos itself. Perga, the capital of Pamphylia, appears only in passing, once and again. No work was done here on the first visit, but the divine power directed Paul, through the weakness and bodily infirmity which affected him, to the real beginning of his proper work. He went across Taurus, a long and dangerous journey, full of perils of rivers and robbers, to Pisidian Antioch, and there achieved instantaneous and marvellous success. Within 12 days almost the whole city was listening to him, and he had turned from the Jews to the Gentiles. Antioch was a Roman colony, the governing city of the southern half of the great province Galatia, military centre for defence against the still dangerous tribes of the Taurus Mountains, lying on the skirts of the Salton Darg. 3,500 feet above sea level. Its peoples shared in the pride of Roman authority, although the mass of them had not the full privilege of Roman citizens. Paul did not appear among them as the aristocratic Roman, but as a poor, weak stranger, suffering from an illness which tried their hearts, because it was believed to be a punishment inflicted by divine power on persons accursed. Yet they did not despise him from the height of their colonial dignity, but received him forthwith as the messenger of God. Not the whole city, however, welcomed Paul. A part held aloof, and this part was doubtless the Roman aristocracy, more dignified, more difficult to move, and not reached by the same address as the older population, for the latter spoke Greek, in which language Paul appealed to them, while the local aristocracy spoke Latin and were for the most part poorly acquainted with Greek. In Antioch it was that Paul turned entirely away from the Jews to the Gentiles. The step taken at Paphos was here carried to its proper completion. It was at Antioch, too, that the intermediate step was taken. On the first Sabbath after his arrival, Paul preached to the mixed audience and addressed them all as brethren, without distinction of race, the first occasion in the history of the Church when that was done frankly and without apology. Luke marks the importance of the step by giving a full resume of the sermon. The step was not made from any preconceived design. Incidentally, little by little, in the course of the sermon, Paul became conscious that it was being made as the divine impulse drove him on. Addressing this new audience, he became sensitive, as a true orator, to something hitherto unknown to him in the character of his audience, and, like an orator, he adapted himself to it, becoming all things to all men. He was aware of a certain sympathetic movement of spirit in the large Gentile part of his audience. This sympathy was the force that brought almost the whole city together a week later. It was already manifest on the first Sabbath. It sprang from a certain affinity of character between the nature of the Anatolian people on the plateau and the Jews. Paul felt it first in Antioch and afterwards in other Galatian cities. It was this same quality that a few years later inclined the Galatian churches to adopt the whole law and ritual of Judaism, and drew upon them the strong condemnation expressed in the letter to the Galatians. This spirit in the pre-Roman population, the mass of the city, became the occasion of Paul's marked forward movement on the first Sabbath in Antioch. On the other hand, the Roman aristocracy of the colony, sons of Western immigrants, had none of that affinity in spirit with the East, but retained their Western character. The Jews, who were now thrown into hostility against Paul, took advantage of the division of feeling. The Romans held the reins of government as the privileged class. To them the Jews went for aid, reaching them through the ladies of their order. Luke does not tell what formal charge was brought against Paul, but we can hardly doubt that he and Barnabas were accused of disturbing the harmony of the state, a vague yet a dangerous pretext which brought about their expulsion. Iconium, still called Konia, to which Paul and Barnabas fled from Antioch, was not a Roman colony but a Hellenized city, that is, a city in which Greek constitutional methods of government by elected magistrates had been established, and Greek civilization and education flourished. The people prided themselves that Iconium was the most ancient of cities, existing before and rebuilt immediately after the flood. The king of Iconium at the flood was Nanankos, and in Greece it became a proverbial expression for immemorial antiquity to say older than Nanankos, as we say before the flood or antediluvian. In this belief that Iconium was the most ancient of cities, there is an interesting analogy with Damascus, where the same belief has always been held. The situation of the two cities is very similar. Each lies on a lofty level plain, Damascus 2,300, Iconium 3,370 feet above the sea. Each lies at the western edge of the plain, which stretches far away to the east, but is bounded by mountains a few miles to the west of the city. Each is well supplied with water that flows down from the mountains on the west, but the small streams that come to Iconium and are exhausted in the city cannot compare in size with the rivers that rush through Damascus to lose themselves in the thirsty plain on the east. Each city, however, profits by the abundant water. The fertile soil becomes a great garden. Both are green with trees which are conspicuous in the distant view, and gladden the eyes of the traveller approaching across the dry plains. Yet there is no monotony in the view from either city across the vast plains, for character and variety are imparted by mountain peaks which rise sharply here and there like islands in an ocean. Iconium and Damascus were also alike in being both cities rather of peace and commerce than of war. Neither could be made a strong city in ancient methods of warfare except by walls of vast size like those of Babylon. Neither was guarded by difficult and steep approaches. Their importance lay in their productiveness and the wealth which they derived from agriculture and trade. Both must attract inhabitants from the beginning of organized human society, and their proud claim to vast antiquity was based on truth and fact. Damascus has bulked far more largely in the eyes of the world than Iconium because it lay closer to the great peoples of ancient history: Jews, Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Arabs. The problem of associating in one city the alien and often hostile minds and manners of Asiatics and Europeans was attempted in different ways at Iconium, at Antioch, and at Tarsus, but in all those great cities of Asia Minor the same problem was engaging attention, and varied constitutions and laws were framed to make possible a peaceful amalgamation of the diverse elements. In Iconium, the Hellenic element consisted mainly of the educated and Hellenized part of the native population, with some immigrant Greeks. But it reckoned itself a Hellenic city, and its inhabitants are correctly called Hellenes by Luke, whereas he never uses the term about Antioch or Lystra, which were Roman colonies. Even in such a small detail as that, he is strictly accurate. Shortly before Paul visited Iconium, the Emperor Claudius had observed and rewarded the loyalty of Iconium by granting to it the title Claudian, and it long was known as the city Claudiconium. This, however, did not make it a Roman colony. It continued to be a Hellenic city throughout the time when Paul was visiting it, as is implied in Acts and is proved by coins and inscriptions. Hadrian honored it with the rank and privileges of a colony about 80 years later. Corresponding to the difference between Antioch, where an aristocracy of Roman colonists was the ruling influence, and Hellenic Iconium, where power lay in the whole body of citizens, were Paul's experiences in the two cities. From Antioch he had been expelled by Jewish foes who influenced the ladies of the aristocracy. In Iconium, those enemies had to accomplish the same object by working on the feelings of the general body of citizens, which is a slower process, and while it was going on, Paul tarried there a long time, speaking boldly. Gradually the population of the city was divided, and part held with the Jews and part with the apostles. The process is characteristic of popular government, such as Hellenic cities loved. Paul was thus able to stay a long time in Iconium, and it is not strange that the city appears in subsequent history as a very important Christian centre, sending its influence far through Central Asia Minor. Iconium was the last city of Phrygia, and the two apostles, after leaving it, crossed the frontier and came into the region of Lycaonia, with its two cities, Lystra and Derbe. There was another part of Lycaonia, which was not at that time within the Roman Empire, and therefore lay outside the limits which Paul set to his work. Lystra was, like Antioch, a Roman colony, with a body of Roman settlers among a large population of rude Lycaonian rustics. It lay in an open valley among the hills, close to the junction of two streams which flow from the western mountains into the plain 20 miles south of Iconium. It never exercised much influence on the development of the country, but remained a small rural town to the end, always attracting some population and deriving moderate wealth from its fertile valley, but by its secluded position unsuited ever to become great. The character of this rude, uneducated country town appears in all Paul's adventures there. Though Greek was certainly the language in which he preached, yet Lycaonian, not Greek, which only educated people knew, was the language most familiar to his worshippers. Paul's appeal to them was in the simple style which suited a rustic people. The populace was easily turned from the extreme of adoration to the extreme of hatred. There were some Hellenes in Lystra, among them Timothy, as we learn later, and Paul reached this educated class, but on the whole he had not great success. Both the rude Lycaonian mob and the Roman aristocracy remained outside his influence. It was the vigorous, progressive people of the middle class, fairly educated, but yet neither cultured dilettanti nor self-satisfied philosophers, among whom Paul found most hearers and converts, though there were in every city a few from the higher classes and a considerable number of the humblest attracted by his teaching. Derbe, where Paul made many disciples, was a city of the open plain on a great road. It derived some importance at this time from its position as a frontier city of the empire, where customs had to be levied on imports and business was active. But like Lystra, it never became important in the history of the church and almost disappeared from notice during the 5th century and later. It is to us little more than a name. The great service to Pauline study of fixing exactly the site of Lystra and approximately that of Derbe was rendered by an American scholar and traveller, Professor Sturrett of Cornell. Ephesus, the commercial capital of the great and wealthy province of Asia, was not in Paul's time the official capital. Hence he never came in contact with the governor of the province, as he did at Corinth with the governor of Achaia, and in Paphos with the governor of Cyprus. It is quite clear that when the riot, which was caused by Demetrius and allayed by the secretary to the city, took place, there was no provincial governor resident in Ephesus. The city, whose deserted site is now 5 miles from the sea, was in the 1st century a seaport, the most important in the whole of Asia. To the Romans, Asia was the name of the province which included the western part of Asia Minor. It was bounded on the east by the province of Galatia, and on the north by the Dardanelles and by the province of Bithynia, and it ranked as the most important in the Roman Empire so far as education and wealth were concerned. Ephesus was the great harbour at the old mouth of the Cayster, from which the products of both the province and many remoter parts of the continent of Asia were carried to Rome. It was the sea end of great routes which stretched far away across Asia Minor and the continent. It was the gate through which Asia looked out towards Europe. Hence already on his 2nd journey Paul was evidently bent on entering the province Asia and going to Ephesus, but he was forbidden by divine command to preach in the province Asia at that time, and was finally, after long wandering, conducted to Europe. Owing to this change of plan on the 2nd journey, the advance of the new faith beyond Galatia did not proceed evenly. Paul found himself following the line of the land road from the east to Rome by way of Troas and Macedonia. Philippi and Amphipolis and Thessalonica lay on this land road, and for a time it seemed as if Paul's work were to be carried on along its course, but again he was diverted from it, and at last he planted his feet firmly on the great central highway from the east by way of Ephesus and Corinth to Rome. Corinth seems to have exercised a marked influence on Paul. There he came to realize that the Roman imperial administration was the protector of the weak against the strong, and the maintainer of order and peace in the cities and the provinces. In the Hellenic cities, the Jews or the mob could generally manage to sway the magistrates against a stranger like himself. Even in the Roman colonies, Lystra, Pisidian Antioch, Philippi, the magistrates were too near the native character. But when he reached the presence of the higher Roman officials, such as Sergius Paulus and Gallio, he experienced fair, sometimes even sympathetic treatment, founded on wide general principles of policy and independent of narrow local interests and considerations. The scheme for the conquest of the Roman Empire now grew clearer in his mind. It had been present long ago to him, but now he saw the best means to that end, and he carried it out through all his future career. Apart from this, there is no proof that the special character or surroundings of Corinth exercised on Paul any serious influence. Especially the theory that he was affected by its proximity to the seat of the Isthmian Games or of the Eleusinian Mysteries seems wholly groundless. There were games and mysteries in all parts of the Hellenic world, and Paul had long ago learnt what their character was. The education and the superficial, rather conceited and opinionative philosophy which was common in Corinth and Athens exercised a repellent effect upon him. He recognized that the self-satisfied philosopher was the slowest to believe and the hardest to convince, but the position of Corinth as the key communication along the central artery of the empire, and as a point where many men from all quarters of the world met in passing, impressed on him the importance of constant intercourse and in the formation and maintenance of a worldwide church. On his 3rd journey, after going through the churches of Galatia, Paul went straight to Ephesus, visiting no other city by the way. He had learnt ere this that the best way of reaching the people was not to go over the smaller cities one by one, but to proceed direct to the capital of each province. In the capital he had the opportunity of addressing not merely the inhabitants of the city itself, but also numbers of people who for one reason or another came to the principal city, some for business, some for religion, some for law, some for education or curiosity. Especially the religion of the great goddess of Ephesus, Artemis or Diana, exercised a strong influence over the whole province of Asia. Many people came on pilgrimage to worship. More came to see the magnificent ceremonies and splendid games by which the magistrates and wealthy citizens honoured the festivals of Diana and made the city brilliant. Such magnificent ceremonies cost large sums of money, but the expenditure was productive because hosts of visitors were attracted to the shows and spent money freely in Ephesus. Here Paul established himself for a long residence and exercised a strong influence on the people. Some of the chief men of the province, wealthy persons who were appointed priests in the worship paid by the province to the Roman emperors as the embodiments of divine power on earth, were his friends. The persons who practiced magic and who were also dabblers in science and investigators of the secrets of nature and practices of spiritualistic arts found that their influence was much diminished. The votaries of the goddess who used to buy offerings to present to the goddess now went to listen to Paul, and all the trades which ministered to the wants of devotees were seriously affected. The theatre in which the rioters gathered to shout their adoration of the goddess and their hatred of Paul is still in a stately ruin of a vast size, and a broad street leads down from its northern extremity to the ancient harbour, now a swamp covered with reeds. Though Paul founded many other churches in the province Asia, this was done through his helpers, such as Timothy, Titus, and others. He himself says that he had never seen the faces of the Colossians or the Laodiceans, but he wrote to them, and he sent envoys to speak in his name. Miletus, on the south shore of the gulf into which the Meander used to fall, though its former shoreline is now many miles distant from the sea, because the river has filled completely up the gulf, Paul did visit more than once. His ship stayed there in AD 57, and the Ephesian elders came to hear his farewell message, and again, years later, after he had returned from the great trial in Rome, we know that he was in Miletus and left his faithful friend Trophimus there sick. Troas played the greatest part in Paul's life of all the cities in Asia except Ephesus. It was a Roman colony and a harbour of importance for communication with the coasts of Macedonia. It was also the sea end of one or more roads from the northern parts of Asia Minor. Thus Paul came down to Troas on his second journey. There he found Luke. There he had the dream which beckoned him on into Europe. From Troas he sailed for Philippi. Again, at a later date, when forced to leave Ephesus, he came to Troas intending to sail for Macedonia. But finding there an open door, he stayed for some time in mission work. Again, on his way to Jerusalem, he sailed from Macedonia to Troas. Many years later, he again visited this important harbour in his progress round the Aegean churches, and there he left the cloak whose want he felt in the winter following. In this review of the geographical surroundings amid which Paul's life was spent, we see how the human spirit gradually emancipates itself from the influence of external circumstances and attains to dominion over them. It is evident that the conditions of life in Tarsus and Jerusalem had great effect in forming Paul's views and opinions. As his character grew stronger and his outlook on the world gained breadth, he gradually learnt to use for his purposes geographical and other external conditions. All the resources of civilization, all the opportunities of life were employed by him with ever-increasing skill and ever-widening experience to further his aims. The pressure of external conditions drove him to Pisidian Antioch, yet in that region he made the conditions subservient to his plans. During the latter part of his career, it is evident that in such cities as Ephesus and Troas, it was no longer the local circumstances which moulded him, but he who employed the local circumstances for the advantage of his work. He used the opportunities of nature, the open door, with the genius of a great administrator. End of section 52. End of Pictures of the Apostolic Church, its Life and Teaching, by William M. Ramsay.